Hi, my name is Taimour Zaman, and in this video, I'm going to share with you how I'm using the resources of former CIA and FBI executives to not only do background checks, but character checks of individuals who I'm doing business with, why it's important, and how to do it for yourself. You know, for years, I was an investor using my own limited capital to do transactions, and very quickly I could see the limitations I had when I was using my own funds to get into multiple transactions. I then graduated into starting up a syndicate with a bunch of my friends and family so that I could raise capital from my friends and my family into opportunities. Over the years, I got to a point where I could leverage my own assets, my operating history, my operating capital with any of the top 40 banks around the world to get lines of credit of millions of dollars. And in that, I've had some bad experiences with business owners or projects where the person who came to the project for my capital had a fraudulent character. And in that experience, I discovered for myself that amateur investors, the best they do is that they go get themselves some really great lawyers and get some really great legal contracts. However, the limitation is the person that you're doing business with, the person you're doing transaction with. If they're a sophisticated con artist, doesn't matter what a great attorney you have and what your legal paperwork is, the emotional pressure there is once you've put the money down and you find that the person you're working with is a fraudulent character, and then you have to go to court and try to get the money out. Although you may have great attorneys and you've had solid, great paperwork, it still takes an emotional toll. It still takes time and energy like that. And so I figured if I can character check and leverage the CIA, folks from CIA and FBI to help me do that, I'm far better off because I'm going to do transactions with people that have the character and the integrity they require to provide my rate of return on my investments. And the impact of that is I go to work having a happier life, if I can say it that way. The video I'm about to share with you is a little bit long. It's about 37 minutes long. You'll meet some of the resources and associations that I use of former CIA deputy director. You'll see one of the world leading body language experts, one of the forensic psychiatrists the CIA uses to look at US adversaries and determine their character and personality traits, some folks from FBI. Just you'll meet folks in my network that I leverage to determine people's character before I put money in them. And I think this is such an important thing to do in today's world where you need to have trust and you need to understand the character of the people you're doing business with. I hope you find the content valuable. If this is something that's of value to you, I'd love to show you how I've done it and help you build this kind of a character reference checks for your investment programs and for the businesses that you're up to. Thank you. The reason that we are here today is because a few years ago, me and my business partners made some bad decisions in terms of investing capital or working with people that had a bad character. And last year, I made the same mistake again, where I put up some capital with the CEO of a company that I thought everything checked out. And I came to the conclusion that money is a magnifier of people's character. And it was very clear to me that I didn't have a way to detect somebody's character. And the people that are around this virtual roundtable, I believe personally, are some of the smartest people on the planet. That's a bold statement for me to say, that can help me solve this. Doug, you're on the top left of my screen, so I'm going to ask you to do a very brief intro on who you are.
I was on loan to CIA, and everything that I tell you about my CIA affiliation has been cleared for public approval by the agency. After I retired in place, I spent the next 3 decades there as a clandestine operations officer, case officer, the business that I was in was to subvert the character of non-Americans and get them to provide us non-public information useful to foreign policy goals of the United States. I did 11 overseas tours. I've been a chief of station 5 times. I've served in Afghanistan, Iraq. I've served in Kosovo, Bosnia. I've served in Asia. I've served in Central America, extended but not living there. And at the end of my time with CIA, I was asked to become the deputy director of the defense counterpart of the Central Intelligence Agency, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency.
So Mark Bowden, and I go under the banner of expert in human behavior and body language. And what I say I do is help people all over the world to stand out, win trust, and gain credibility every time they communicate. And at the moment, I have clients who are anything from people who are solo entrepreneurs starting something new, entrepreneurs who've created something extraordinary and massive, many of which you might know, people who lead G7 powers right now, and all and sundry. I've written 4 books on human behavior and body language. They're scattered around here, many of which are in languages that I don't even speak. And in about, I guess it would have been the 90s, some people in politics came to me and said, could you do this with politicians? Because they knew the work that I was doing with anything from Jim Henson's Creature Shop, working with puppets and animation. And they knew that what I was focused on was, how do you cause other people to trust you or fear you? Because in film and TV and theater, you've got to make that happen really quickly. And what does a human being need to see in order to know that person is going to be bad for them, that character, and that person they can trust, and that's going to be good? And I was interested in what's the minimum you can do in order to trigger that result in another human being. Anyway, politics came to me. Could you do this with politicians? I said, yeah, probably could. And so I started working in politics, and then I went on to work in business, really in just presentation training. How do you get other people to listen to what you have to say and trust what you have to say even before you've started saying it? So I was in this area of trust and credibility.
So I applied to the FBI. They decided that they would go ahead and bring me on. Took them a while. They were a very, very slow background process to do. It's thorough, but good gosh, is it slow. So I finally got hired by them in 2009, and they shipped me straight out to Los Angeles, where there was no shortage of fraud, and immediately put me on a mortgage fraud squad. This was right after the crash of the real estate market, and so the fraudsters had flocked, as they are wont to do, to the latest opportunity. And the opportunity at that time was foreclosure delay schemes. Everybody was getting kicked out of their houses. How could we scam them, promise them they can stay in their house and still take their money? And I investigated a number of those, and then morphed into Ponzi schemes. I was telling Taimour the other day, ended up chasing an international fugitive into Toronto. And we did this, it'd be fun to tell you the story, but we ended up catching this guy who'd been on the run for 12 years and bringing him back to the US. And I really enjoyed the white collar. I had a lot of fun. I was very good at it. But I also was getting to the point where it was starting to become repetitive. And I wanted a little bit of a challenge. So I switched over to counterterrorism. I joined the Joint Terrorism Task Force out in LA, and then got bumped up to management and moved back to DC. Went down to a little bit of time at headquarters, a little bit of time at a place called Liberty Crossing, where we share the boat with the CIA. Did some fun stuff and learned something incredibly important that's changed my perspective about the way I deal with everything. In the white collar world, as far as fraud goes, it's always after the fact. You can put some fraud prevention measures in place, but as far as investigations go, you're simply chasing the breadcrumbs, uncovering the puzzle, solving the puzzle. With counterterrorism, you couldn't do that. You couldn't wait till someone blew up a location and then try to figure, we got to stop. You got to stop the guy ahead of time, or the gal ahead of time. And so it was a completely different world. And I've mentioned before the Minority Report movie always kind of comes to mind, where Tom Cruise, they've got to go and try and stop a crime that someone's thinking about doing before they ever do it. And I felt like we were doing that in the counterterrorism side. And we have to get into someone's life and into their world and know more about them than their spouse did or their kids did, and be able to predict what they're going to do, and then match that with enough action steps that the prosecutors will be willing to take into court on it. So it was a completely different mindset, a shift from after the fact to prevention. And so I started to put together, in my mind, the idea that you could marry those two. You could do really good prevention, really good investigative techniques, but apply them to prevention up front by looking at someone's character and looking at a lot of what else they do besides the normal things that people check, the normal data points people look at, which are really just moments in time in the past. So I moved up in the bureau, to finish my story real quick, moved up in the bureau to inspection division, and then got a back injury, and that put me out of the bureau. So I'm functional, but I still claim disability when I need to, when it's useful. So I'm out and have been trying to consult in the mortgage fraud arena, which I've been doing for the last year and a half or so. And then Taimour's come along and grabbed my attention with maybe doing some of that forward thinking, back to my passion of combining investigative techniques with character and prevention techniques up front. So that's kind of my background on that.
I'm Ken DeCleva. I live in Dallas, Texas, where I practice psychiatry at UT Southwestern Medical School. And with the exception of a 14-year hiatus with the U.S. Department of State from 2002 to 2016, mostly overseas, 5 overseas tours and 1 tour in Washington, Texas has been my home since the early 80s. My interest in this topic kind of comes from my background as a psychiatrist. During the 90s, I worked in a variety of clinical roles affiliated with the university, where I worked in a jail for several years as a psychiatrist in a large county emergency room that serves a catchment area for 3 million people. And I had a small I worked in a prison clinic, and I had a small forensic private practice as well. I had like 4 jobs, where I consulted with in criminal cases with federal prosecutors, federal defense attorneys, and state and local prosecutors and defense attorneys on criminal cases. Typically, these were violent crimes like capital murder, and sexual assault and child sexual assault. But with the federal cases, I had a number of white-collar cases where they would call me in to look at issues of what's called mitigation at sentencing, to see if there were any mitigating factors, medical or psychological or psychiatric, that would allow for what's called downward departure from sentencing guidelines. So I learned a lot about all the different kind of cases I saw and people I treated. I learned a lot about not only character, but the absence of character. So I lived in Russia for 5 years, India for 2 years, Mexico for 2 years, Western Europe for 3 years, including, thank you, Mark, London for a year. And so I traveled a lot. The travel burden was about 2/3 of my time. The other area I became interested in the 90s, and I talked with Taimour a bit about, was my interest in leadership analysis, studying our adversaries. I started this work with my mentor, where I'm seeing patients all day, but in the evenings and weekends, I'm having a lot of fun studying and writing profiles of adversary leaders such as Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, and these have been published in a variety of national security type venues. And I've given some lectures in academia and for the government.
My intuition says you probably at some point start to see some patterns. And then I'm also making the assumption that when Ken doing his work, I bet Ken you saw some patterns, whether it was a child molester or rapist or that. And then Mark, I don't want to say you do this for a living, but I bet there's a storyboard here of how you guys connected different dots together. And I'd love to learn about those dots. specifically, how do you determine somebody's character?
There's different types of bad actors, and so I there's the hardcore, just bad apples, man. They're just dark in the heart, or their hearts are turned off from their brain, or they seared their conscience, or whatever it is. But in the at least in the white collar space, which is part of what I think we deal with, it's been my experience that you've got either the folks who are intentionally doing bad things. In the violence area, you've got folks who might engage what we call crimes of passion. They move past all their barriers in an instant. But for most of, at least the white collar crime, it's a slow slide. It begins with a small decision to shade the truth or bend a little ethical rule here or there. There's no consequence to that. There's maybe a beneficial return, and so the next time they take a little bit more of a step. I guess in social psychology, this is like hearkening back to knowing absolutely nothing about psychology and psychiatry. It's what I remember from college we called the old foot in the door phenomenon. Once you take the little step, the next step's a little bit bigger, a little bit easier to take. And when we would sit down after we'd arrested somebody, the very first thing the AUSA would do, the prosecutor, he'd spend 15 to 30 minutes trying to get across to the guy we arrested the concept that he'd committed a crime. Because 99 times out of 100, once they'd gone down the path of engaging in fraud, they had convinced themselves along the way that they weren't doing anything wrong. And so it was always interesting to sit in those meetings and try to listen to their justifications, listen to them slowly break down how they got there from where they started. And I say all that because I think part of what we need to check for, if we're looking at some sort of character checking thing, is we need some sort of ongoing monitoring or some sort of way to check in with people with where their thought processes are. There's probably some ways to measure with certain questions, judgmental questions or scenario questions, or I don't know how to do it exactly, but there's got to be some way where we could say, here's your baseline, and then we ask you something similar in 6 months or a year, and it looks like you've slipped on what you'd be willing to do. And now 2 years down the road or 18 months down the road, wow, you've really gone down the road. We really need to flag you. I don't think that's the entire thing by any stretch, but I think it might be part of it. I also think we need to check in for people for duress. And I'll certainly lean on Doug for this. If you're going to get somebody to turn around on some of their core values, there's usually a weakness or some sort of pressure point that is more important to them at the moment. The getting away from the pain is more important than anything else. And it could be, a relational issue or a financial issue, reputational issue, whatever it is. But I think you can check in on those things as well, because somebody who's not unwilling to commit fraud today or commit treason today, in 6 months might be completely willing to do so because their life circumstances have changed. And where you gave them a contract or whatever your contact with them is up front was them at a certain point in time, 6 months down the road, now they've got your $5 or $10 million. And if you don't pay attention, you don't realize their life has changed and they run away with the money because they've got their own reasons.
I think what you're looking at, if you're looking at the area of white collar, and I evaluated several white collar criminals for possible mitigation and in 2 cases for insanity. Insanity is a legal criteria that's hard to meet. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but there were mitigating circumstances. And these were cases that the violent criminals a lot of them were different because if you look at a caseload of capital murder defendants or they're predators. They have psychopathy, and we would do various rating scales and interview them, and that would all light up. And certainly, it's a given that past behavior predicts present and future behavior in general, in all people. But I think you have to sort of tease out that component, which is a very and there's sort of several threads here. One is a pathway to violence type of thinking, as Kevin was saying, or a pathway to criminality. It's been written about in the espionage business by psychologists and psychiatrists who work with the intelligence community, a pathway to espionage. And these are the people who will commit espionage, but it's not really in their character to do so, versus people who were either ideological from the get-go or were psychopathic and did it out of pure spite and greed and didn't care about the consequences of agents being executed, sort of like Aldrich Ames or Robert Hansen are the cases that come to mind. But there are many other cases where people will feel guilt, remorse, shame, and regret when they're caught. And those are the people that the prosecutors can then make a deal with by tapping into the old character values that the person brings to the table. That's how they pull them back and get them to make a deal. Doug has interviewed thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people who they tried to convert to share their information with the United States for national security. I've interviewed hundreds of criminal offenders in my career, and I've also in rare cases interviewed people that were victims or perpetrators of terrorism. So I think you're selecting for positive character traits in that regard, and people that can work well with groups or teams.
But the fact of the matter is that, collecting data by somebody who's not yet connected to you then is purely dependent upon what's available in investigative, bringing to bear, investigative tools. And there too, your ability to extract useful data that provides you a full and complete picture ahead of the engagement with the individual, that becomes really challenging because you're never going to have enough data. And then when you meet them, then that begins where you bring in the power and majesty of Mark Bowden, which is where the human is now a significant part of the judgment process. And then, like I said, once you've decided that their character is good, their core values are good, their history has been consistent with their values and with their character, and so the AI machine sits and crunches all the data and says, it gives you a probability of some kind, I suppose. But in the end, it's an extraordinary challenge, because what you're trying to do is replicate without contamination, without intellectual contamination. What the human being does when I sit down and meet with you. And I ask you a number of questions, and my job was not to look passively at somebody's character. My job was to find the flaws in their character and to realize that their character is a function of the environment, which is highly dynamic. It's not static. You make a decision, you get good character, and you're going to have good character forever. I think Kevin's story proves that's not the case. Opportunities will contaminate and will dramatically change a person's character, I think.
I work at a brain institute where they've raised $500 million in private funds in the last 5 years. And I work with some of the leading researchers in neuroscience in the world who are studying these questions. They're looking for biomarkers of depression, of psychosis, and personality. I've interviewed criminals, murderers, serial killers, child molesters, rapists, and they look like your neighbor next door. And there's no way to know that they were a monster inside. They're even experienced forensic investigators from the FBI, detectives that have, thousands of man years of experience in interviewing these people, forensic psychologists and psychiatrists. Experts can still be wrong because a lot of this stuff is soft. There's not hard science, it's soft science. Since we're talking about Israel, Doug will know about this guy, and maybe Mark will. The most famous interrogator in the Israeli Secret Service was a guy named Michael Kubi. And he did a couple of interviews about 10 years ago, and actually another Mark Bowden wrote an article about it. And Kubi was a very skilled interrogator because he spoke Arabic that he had learned as a child, and he knew various dialects. So he could rattle the terrorist defendant who they had caught because he could speak the dialect like it was from the village that they came from. But even Kubi admitted in an interview, he said, the people that I can't read are Bedouins. I just can't get a read on Bedouins because it's a cultural thing. So that's the other part of any kind of character analysis. You have to look at culture. We've all lived, many people here on this panel have either lived in or are from different cultures. And there are cultures where they're very emotional inside, but their face doesn't register emotion. Russians are like that. I spent 5 years in Russia. But when you get them drunk, or when they get to know you, they're very emotional. Anyone who's read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Chekhov or Turgenev knows the Russians are passionate, but they don't. Different cultures show emotions in different ways. So
I think the important thing here for me is what character is the choices that we make under pressure. It's just the choices. It's just the choices that you make. So how do you judge somebody's character? Well, we get data from them along the relationship, and we kind of go, okay, yes, if Doug says he's going to do something, I've got enough experience that says he does it. So, for me, Doug's a good character because he does what he says. And then, of course, something comes around, Doug's life changes somewhat and he has access to money that I might have. And then, he sees me being unfair. And suddenly, Doug's not a good character for me anymore because he goes and steals my money. And I didn't see that coming because I'd got all this data stored up that he was a great person. What we're trying to look at is how early could you know that somebody might do something socially unacceptable to you before it happens? And then I'd say, how inaccurate are you happy for that to be? Because we get instincts about people. And sometimes our instincts are absolutely accurate, sometimes they're totally wrong, and anything else in between. But our instinct is happy to be inaccurate for our own safety in order to be accurate tomorrow. It doesn't care about the truth. It doesn't care about whether somebody's, a liar or a truth teller. It would rather be wrong today and safe and live long enough to be accurate tomorrow. And so my guess is a piece of AI or an algorithm has to have the same kind of attitude. It has to go, all right, there's a pool of 100 people who we could do business with. I'm prepared to be really inaccurate and discount a whole bunch of them based on some fairly minimal criteria, because there's a big pool of people who we could do business with, and we'll just eradicate until we're close to the person who we think would be least likely to dupe us down the road. Even when presented with the opportunity, they would probably have the character not to dupe us. But we've excluded a whole bunch of people. Now, having said that, if there's 2 people to choose from who can only supply to us, now I'm like, I don't really want to eradicate anybody because now my choices are low. So, for me, the AI, it's distilling what is such a complex situation down into models that create an end result.
I'm interviewing you.
Yes, sir.
Welcome to the interview. Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming in. I know it was an effort on you. And so what happens is I set the conditions for a positive, discussion. So I have to say the right things. I have to behave in the right way to set the conditions. Then what I do is I say, Taimour, why don't you tell me a little? I mean, I read your application, and I think you have a fascinating background, but I'd really like you to give me the personal part of what you wrote. And then you do that. And actually, when you're done, I'll do the same for you, because I want to make sure that you know a little bit more about me. So again, that we can have a little bit of rapport and a little bit of trust in this session, because I think it's important. So you go through and you do your thing. Then I go through and give you my background. And then I ask you the following question. Based on this session and this session alone, what process would you go through to judge my character? And then it forces you to sit and identify what issues are important to you in making the character assessment. And I think on average, you come up with a pretty good framework trying to articulate how you'd apply that framework to judge whether I'm trustworthy or not, whether I have good character or not. And often as not, you will identify, thank you very much for me, as you are providing that framework, you're now identifying your own strengths of character, because you mentioned what's important to you about my assessed character, and you identify your own character shortcomings and weaknesses, because you will try to identify those in my background. That question is very useful.
But to baseline somebody based on their eye movements as to where they go when they are telling you something that has actually happened to them, and where their eyes go when they're telling you something that hasn't happened and they're making it up. So that may be in certain circumstances what we might call deceit. So first of all, you have to baseline where their eyes go when they're telling you something they already know. So an easy question is, for anybody American, is tell me the fifth word of the Star Spangled Banner. And you'll see that they'll go quiet for a bit, and then their eyes will go somewhere to go and, to grab that word from their memory. Now you probably want to do it again on something else so that you got a couple of tries at that. And then if you go, look, tell me what you did yesterday, and you can tell me the truth or lie very, very quickly, you know that they're going to tell you something that is inaccurate, because their eyes go somewhere very different from where they went for the fifth word of the Star Spangled Banner. But just as Minaz is saying there, you get a little fly in the ointment. They're under stress and pressure. So first thing you're going to do in interrogation is relax people. Make sure they're not under stress and pressure. Make them your friend. From my point of view, all of this is kind of possible, of creating a piece of AI that might get fairly good enough based on the economics going on, of like how happy are we about it getting it wrong? Because the stakes are high enough that if we get it wrong a few times, who cares? Who cares if we eradicate people off of the list and they weren't perpetrators? It doesn't matter. It's so bad if it happens that we're okay to get it wrong. So you can create an algorithm around that quite easily, I would say, that turns complexity into something simple enough, and its results are okay enough.
Even the most skilled interviewers, if you're trying to, in medicine, for example, in my field or in Kevin's field or Doug's field, interview an autistic person, they don't give off body language signals. This is why the first paper on autism by an Austrian psychiatrist was called Autism and Psychopathy. And psychopaths don't give off any emotional signals, including biometric things that we're now learning more about. Schizophrenics may not give off those kind of signals that you can reach easily. So there's a lot of variety in humanity in that regard. So I think I think we have to rely on the human element and what we're good at, the select in. I think you're going to select out in a business world, like Taimour's saying, who do I go into business with where you're investing large sums of money? The select out part's easier. It's reputational. You look at their background. There's a lot of things you can do. The select in is a harder part. That term actually comes from NASA astronaut selection, which is who's going to work well with the team. We would look at a variety of meetings with people who were hiring, for example, and often the people that would pick up the most valuable information were, quote, the little people, the non-experts, the secretary, or when you take someone out, a client out for dinner, how do they treat the waiter or the person in the elevator? If they're told to wait, are they rude? Are they snippy? Do they greet them? Do they make eye contact with them? There's a lot of social cues that can help when you look at a broader database of different views. It's like a different prism.
Well, here's what we know as well is that people, as the stakes get higher, people get even better at deception.
Right. Yes.
You're right. Because that we're all already good at deception. If we're socially skilled, we're all very good at it anyway. And the moment things become even more pressure, we can get even better at it. Now, the really bad people, it's hard to, the psychopaths. Yeah, they don't show any emotion, but some of them are really good at pretending they're having them as well, because they've learned how to do it. So even that, they can be superb deceivers and liars, and some of the best, because they're great mimics, brilliant mimics. But I totally agree with what you're saying. There has to be ongoing. You got to keep checking up. Has anything changed for you? Are you under any pressure? Have you got access that you didn't have before to things that we hold as valuable? Do you feel anybody's being unfair to you?
Yeah.
Because again, that will they're being deceitful and unfair. I'll just do it as well. I'll just follow the leader who's being deceitful and unfair.
Or it won't surprise you to know I've played 1,000 hours of golf. And Ken's absolutely right. It is one of the most perfect scenario-based, unstructured, where natural behaviors come out because there's wins, there's losses, there's partnership, there's graciousness, there's every bit of human emotion. Into that golf tapestry are the threads of every bit of human behavior that we're concerned with.
So one of the questions I'm constantly asked is, how can your company help me out? And the answer is in 3 ways. One is get a copy of our book, Hypergrowth, How to Connect to Customers and Investors in New Ways. You will discover how exponential companies are thinking differently, questions they're asking differently, mindset exercises that we've put into the book, fantastic case studies, and also how to pitch to investors. The second way that we could help you out is part of our service. We can work with you, our team can work with you to look at your investment deck to help tweak it for your business, how to pitch investors, VCs correctly, how do you tell a story that's engaging and really stands out, how to cut through the noise like that. And so if you're interested in that kind of a service, feel free to book a call with us. And then the third way, which is our most, I would say the premium product in our organization, is our multiplier product, where if you're looking for a line of credit, what we do is we take capital that you've already secured, we leverage that capital with multiple financial institutions with our reputations on the line, and then we take that $2 million, we go to a US bank as an example, we get a line of credit for $8 million on that. We take that $8 million through a proprietary process we have into Canada. We get another line of credit on top of that for, let's say, $16 million. That's how we multiply available cash experienced investor that has an entrepreneurial project has kind of thing. So if that resonates for you, again, please feel free to book an appointment with us, and our team would be delighted to look at your case and look at how we can help you get capital quickly.